The letter wasn't even sealed properly. That was the first thing Vivian Hale noticed. The wax had been pressed in a hurry, already cracking at the edges when the station master slid it across the counter with the kind of look a man gives a stray dog he doesn't want to touch. She should have known then, but she took it anyway, turned away from the crowd already gathering on the platform, and broke it open with one steady finger. 3 lines. That's all Edmund Graves had given her after 4 months of letters, 2 train tickets, and every dollar she'd scraped together from teaching children their alphabet in a schoolroom that smelled like mildew. I have reconsidered the arrangement. You are not what I require. Do not come to the house. Not what he required. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully, tucked it into her coat pocket, and turned back around to face a platform full of strangers who had already decided everything they needed to know about her. If you've ever stood somewhere completely alone and realized the ground you were standing on had just disappeared, then you already know exactly what Vivian felt in that moment. And if you're watching this for the first time, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Bluff, because what happened next on that platform changed everything. The trunk was the problem. It wasn't a large trunk by any reasonable standard, but it was the only one Vivian owned, and it held everything she had brought from Philadelphia. 3 dresses, a wool blanket, a box of chalk, 2 teaching primers, and a small tin of her mother's sewing needles that she had kept for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. The trunk weighed perhaps 40 pounds. Under normal circumstances, 40 pounds was nothing. But Vivian had been sitting on a train for 4 days. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since Missouri, and her hands were shaking, not from grief, not yet, because grief hadn't arrived, but from something colder. The specific hollow fear of a person who has just realized there is no plan B. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The trunk moved about 6 inches across the platform boards and stopped. She pulled again. Same result. Around her, the afternoon crowd shuffled and muttered. 3 cowboys leaned against the depot wall, watching her with the flat amusement of men who have nothing better to do and know it. 2 women in bonnets whispered to each other behind gloved hands. A child pointed until his mother smacked his arm down, but the mother kept looking. Vivian did not ask for help. She had learned early in life that asking for help from strangers on a train platform in a town where you know no one is the fastest way to make yourself into something people feel entitled to pity. And pity in a frontier town was its own kind of trap. So she set her feet, bent her knees the way her father had once taught her to lift feed sacks, and she heaved. The trunk moved a foot, then another. She was dragging it now, one grinding inch at a time, across rough planks that caught on the leather bottom and made a sound like a complaint. Nobody moved. That was when she heard the voice, not directed at her, but loud enough to carry clearly across the platform. Well, there's your mail order mistake right there. It came from one of the cowboys against the wall. He said it the way men say things when they want credit for wit without the risk of confrontation. Loud enough for an audience, quiet enough to pretend it was private. The 2 women in bonnets pressed their lips together in that particular way that means they agree but won't say so in public. Vivian stopped dragging the trunk. She straightened slowly, turned toward the voice, and looked at the man who had said it. He was somewhere in his 40s, sunburned, with a mustache that was trying very hard. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away, which told her everything. The brave ones hold the look. The cowards throw the words and then find something interesting to study on the middle distance. She turned back to her trunk and kept moving. That was when she heard a different sound. Boots. Deliberate, unhurried, not the quick step of someone with somewhere important to be, but the steady pace of a man who has already decided something and is simply walking toward the conclusion of that decision. She didn't look up. The boots stopped beside her trunk. A pair of hands, work-scarred, knuckles that had been split and healed more than once, closed around the leather handle. The trunk came up off the platform boards in a single motion, lifted onto a broad shoulder as if 40 pounds was an afterthought. She looked up then. He was not what you would call a handsome man, not in the way Edmund Graves had been handsome in the photograph he'd sent her, all pomade and a carefully pressed collar. This man's face was weathered in the way that happens when someone spends 20 years outdoors and stops caring what the sun thinks. He was perhaps 38, perhaps 42, the kind of age that's hard to pin on a man who works land for a living. Brown eyes, a jaw that needed a razor, a hat that had seen better decades. He looked at her directly, not at her dress, not at her trunk, not at the letter still folded in her coat pocket. At her. "Gideon Mercer," he said. "I've got a wagon around the side." Vivian stared at him. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "Then why are you—" "Because nobody else was going to." He said it simply, without drama, the way someone states a fact about the weather. Then he turned and started walking toward the side of the depot, her trunk balanced on his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. She stood there for a moment. Behind her, she could hear the platform crowd shifting, murmuring, recalibrating their understanding of the afternoon's entertainment. The cowboy with the mustache had gone quiet. The women in bonnets were no longer whispering to each other. Vivian picked up her traveling bag and followed Gideon Mercer. She would think later, much later, sitting on the porch of Iron Mesa Ranch watching the sun go down over land that had tried very hard to kill both of them, that following a stranger with her trunk was arguably the second most impulsive thing she'd done that year. The first was answering an advertisement for a bride in a newspaper, placed by a man she'd never met, in a town she'd never heard of, 3,000 miles from anything she knew. But impulsive and wrong are different things. She had learned that too, eventually. The wagon was where he said it would be. A working wagon, not a gentleman's buggy, the kind with the boards worn smooth and a wheel that had been repaired recently with wood that didn't quite match the original. 2 horses, both solid-looking, neither of them particularly interested in Vivian's arrival. Gideon loaded the trunk into the back with the same economy of motion he'd used to pick it up, then walked around to the front and climbed to the driver's seat. He didn't tell her to get in. He didn't offer his hand. He simply waited. Vivian climbed up on her own. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Iron Mesa Ranch. It's about 8 miles out." "I haven't agreed to go to Iron Mesa Ranch." He looked at her then, sideways, with an expression that was difficult to read, not impatience exactly, but something adjacent to it. "You can get down and go back to the platform if you prefer." She thought about that. The platform, with its cowboy wit and its whispering bonnets, and its station master who had handed her that letter like it was a dead thing he didn't want to hold. The town of Red Bluff stretched beyond the depot in both directions, and she knew approximately no one in it, and had approximately $11.40 to her name. 8 miles, she repeated, give or take. "What's at Iron Mesa Ranch?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Work, if you want it." "What kind of work?" "The kind that needs doing." The wagon started moving. Vivian gripped the seatboard and decided that was not actually a sufficient answer. "Mr. Mercer," she kept her voice level, "I have just been stranded in a town I've never seen, by a man who apparently could not be bothered to inform me of his change of heart before I crossed the entire country. I am not in the mood for vague. What kind of work?" He was quiet again. Then something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a slight easing around the eyes that suggested he was reassessing something. "The ranch has books," he said. "Financial records. About 6 years of them. Some kept better than others. Most of them not kept at all since my foreman left last spring. I've been trying to hold off the bank with one hand and keep the herd together with the other, and I'm losing both fights." Vivian absorbed this. "You need an accountant. I need someone who can read a contract and tell me if I'm being cheated, and someone who can find out why I'm being cheated, which I'm fairly certain is happening, and someone who won't fall apart when Calvin Rourke's men ride up and suggest I ought to sell." He paused. "Can you do that?" "I taught school for 4 years," she said. "I managed the books for the parish and the schoolhouse fund and the town library on top of my regular pay because no one else would do it. I found $300 in misfiled accounts that the parish didn't know it had." She straightened. "And I do not fall apart." Another of those sideways looks. This one lasted longer. "Wages," he said. "Fair ones. Your own room. No one bothers you. I want to see every document connected to the ranch. Every contract, every bank letter, every deed, every survey." "All right. And I make my own decisions about what I find." "Wouldn't have it any other way." The wagon moved through the edge of town. Vivian watched Red Bluff slide past, The general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office, with a window that needed replacing, a church with a crooked steeple. A few people on the street looked up at the wagon. More than a few of them recognized Gideon Mercer. She could tell by the way their expressions changed. Not hostility exactly, but wariness, the particular look people give a man they've already written off as a losing bet. "They think you're done," she said. "Most of them." "Are you?" He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "Not yet," he said finally, "but it's close." She nodded. Close was something she understood. Close was something you could work with. It was only as the wagon cleared the last buildings of Red Bluff and the open land spread out ahead of them, grassland and scrub and sky that went on longer than anything she'd seen back east, that Vivian let herself feel the full weight of the morning. The letter, thin and carelessly sealed, sitting in her pocket. Edmund Graves, whom she'd spent 4 months exchanging careful, considered correspondence with, who had described himself as an honest and forward-thinking man seeking a capable partner, who had looked at her photograph, a plain, direct photograph, no artifice, and written back to say she sounded exactly right. "Not what I require." The anger arrived then, not loudly, but solidly, like a door closing somewhere inside her chest. Not at Edmund specifically, she would sort her feelings about Edmund later, privately, when she could afford to, but at the whole architecture of it. The arrangement that required her to cross the country on someone's word alone. The system that left women with exactly as many choices as men were willing to give them. The platform full of people who watched and whispered and did nothing. She was not what Edmund Graves required. Fine. She would find out what she required and she would build it herself. The road to Iron Mesa Ranch cut north through open land, and the afternoon light fell long and level across everything, and Vivian Hale sat straight in the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set at an angle that Gideon Mercer would come to recognize over time as the angle that meant she had made a decision, and the decision was not open for discussion. He didn't know that yet, but he would. They didn't speak much for the remaining miles, which suited Vivian. She had things to think through, and thinking required quiet, and Gideon Mercer seemed like a man who understood the value of silence. Not the uncomfortable kind that needs to be filled, but the working kind, where two people sit together and each one thinks their own thoughts without apologizing for it. What she was thinking about was the letter. Not the rejection itself. She had, if she was honest, spent enough time during the train ride studying Edmund Graves' previous correspondence to suspect that something wasn't entirely adding up. His letters had been articulate, yes, and detailed in the ways she'd found appealing. Specific questions about her teaching methods, genuine seeming curiosity about her opinions on land management and record keeping. But there had been a quality to the later letters, the ones from the last 6 weeks, that had shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. Shorter, slightly more formal, like a man writing out of obligation rather than anticipation. She had told herself she was imagining it. She had told herself she was nervous, which was reasonable, and that nervousness was making her read things into simple sentences that weren't there. She had folded those doubts and packed them neatly away, the same way she'd packed her 3 dresses and her mother's sewing needles, and she had gotten on the train. So the rejection itself was not what she kept circling back to. It was the 3 lines, the specific phrasing. "You're not what I require." Not, "I've changed my mind." Not, "I've met someone else," or "circumstances have altered," or "I've reconsidered the practicality of the arrangement." Nothing that suggested this was a decision he had arrived at reluctantly or with any understanding of what it cost her. "You are not what I require." The phrasing of a man accustomed to returning merchandise. She pulled the letter from her pocket, read it one more time, then folded it back. She would keep it. Not because she wanted to, but because she had learned early in life that you keep things that reveal character. You never know when that information becomes useful. The ranch came into view slowly, the way things reveal themselves at dusk. First the windmill, then the outline of the main barn, then the house itself, longer than she'd expected, with a covered porch running the front length of it. The buildings were not elegant. They were functional in the way that suggested someone had once cared about them deeply and then run out of something. Time, money, hope, possibly all 3 in sequence. Fences that needed mending, A garden space that had gone to weeds but still had the ghost of organization in its layout, the remnant shape of someone's careful plan. She caught herself calculating automatically. What would need to be done first? What could wait? Where the structural problems were versus the cosmetic ones. It was a habit she'd developed young, taking inventory before committing to any project. Her father had called it being careful. Her mother had called it being cold. Vivian had always thought they were both missing the point. She just didn't see any reason to pretend things were different than they were. The wagon pulled up to the house, and a boy of about 12 appeared in the barn doorway, looked at Vivian with the unfiltered curiosity of a child, and then disappeared again without a word. "That's Daniel," Gideon said, climbing down. "He's the son of my head hand. He lives here." He didn't say hello. He doesn't much, not at first. He lifted the trunk down from the wagon. "You'll have to earn it." She found that oddly reassuring. Places where everyone was immediately charming were usually places with things to hide. The inside of the house smelled like wood smoke and something that had been dried and stored too long. The main room was large and functional. A table, chairs, a stone fireplace, a desk in the corner piled with papers in a way that made Vivian's fingers itch from across the room. A woman of perhaps 60, broad-shouldered and wearing an apron that had seen more use than the rest of the kitchen combined, appeared in the doorway to what was apparently the back of the house. "Mrs. Eula," Gideon said. "This is Vivian Hale. She'll be staying." Mrs. Eula looked Vivian over with the frank assessment of someone who has been around long enough to not bother pretending she isn't judging. Then she said, "You eat pork?" "Yes," Vivian said. "Good. Supper's in an hour. Room's through there, second door." She disappeared back into the kitchen without further ceremony. Vivian looked at Gideon. "She's not unfriendly," he said. "She just decides about people on her own schedule." "I understand that completely," Vivian said. She carried her own bag to the room, second door as directed, a small space with a window, a bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. She set her bag on the bed and sat beside it and looked at the room. Not what Edmund Graves required. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the rough timber of it, the way the evening light was starting to come through the window at a low angle. Then she stood up, opened her bag, hung her second-best dress on the hook, and went back out to ask Gideon Mercer where he kept the ranch's financial records. He was standing at the desk in the corner of the main room, looking at the pile of papers with the expression of a man staring at something in a language he can't read. "All of it," she said, stopping beside the desk. "Everything you have, every piece of paper connected to this land." He looked at her. Something passed across his face that she couldn't quite identify. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. Like a man who's been holding his breath for a very long time and has just been told it might be safe to stop. "Most of it's in boxes," he said. "In the back room." "Show me." He showed her. There were 4 crates of documents, 1 leather-bound ledger that dated back 12 years, 3 rolled survey maps, and a battered tin box that held what appeared to be correspondence from the Territorial Land Office going back 7 years. There was also a stack of bank letters tied with twine, a folder of contracts in various states of completion, and a hand-drawn property map with so many corrections and annotations layered on top of each other that the original lines were nearly impossible to find. Vivian stood in the middle of it and felt the particular, focused calm that came over her when confronted with a problem that was large enough to be serious but organized enough, underneath the chaos, to be solved. "How long has Calvin Rourke been pushing on your water rights?" she asked. Gideon's expression shifted. "About 2 years." "And when did the bank start calling the debt?" 18 months ago. She looked at the battered tin box, then at the stack of bank letters. "Those 2 things started very close together," she said. "I know. Did that seem like a coincidence to you?" He didn't answer immediately, then, "Less and less." She picked up the tin box and the stack of bank letters and carried them to the table. "Supper first," she said. "Then I start." Gideon Mercer watched her set the documents on the table with the careful precision of someone who knows exactly what she's doing, and something in his chest did a quiet, uncertain thing that he hadn't felt in a long time and wasn't sure he trusted. He went to tell Mrs. Eula there would be 2 for supper. Behind him, in the lamplight that was just beginning to matter as the sun went down outside the window, Vivian Hale opened the tin box and began to read. The ranch around her was quiet in the way that things are quiet before they change. She didn't know yet what she would find in those letters, the signatures, the dates, the careful overlapping timing of financial pressure and legal maneuvering that would eventually tell a story nobody in Red Bluff had been paying close enough attention to see. She would find it. She always found things. That was both her greatest strength and, as she had been told more than once by people who found it inconvenient, her most exhausting quality. She turned the first page and began. She found the first discrepancy at 11:30 at night. It wasn't dramatic. Discrepancies rarely announce themselves with any ceremony. It was a number in the margin of a bank letter from 14 months ago, written in pencil so faint she almost missed it, a loan figure that didn't match the corresponding entry in the ledger. Not by much. $47. Small enough to be a clerical error. Small enough that a busy man running a ranch with one hand and fighting off legal pressure with the other would never catch it. She set that letter aside and kept reading. Mrs. Eula had come through at 9 o'clock to put out the lamp in the kitchen and tell Vivian, without any particular warmth but without hostility either, that there was coffee on the stove if she needed it and that the floorboards in the hallway creaked so she should step to the left when she went to bed. It was the most words the woman had strung together at one time, and Vivian took it for what it was. A small, practical act of welcome from someone who gave those out slowly. Gideon had stayed at the table with her for the first hour, not reading over her shoulder but present in the way that a man is present when something important is happening in his own house and he doesn't know whether to help or stay out of the way. He'd answered her questions. Yes, that survey was from the original land grant. No, he hadn't seen a copy of the amended creek boundary filing. Yes, Calvin Rourke had first approached him about buying the ranch approximately 3 years ago, before the legal troubles started. She'd written that down. "Go to bed," she told him eventually, not unkindly. "I think better without someone watching me." He'd gone without argument, which she appreciated. Now it was nearly midnight, and the lamp was burning low, and Vivian had a letter in one hand and the ledger open in front of her, and the $47 discrepancy was sitting next to 2 more she'd found in the subsequent pages. $62, and then, 3 months later, $111. None of them were recording errors. She knew the difference. Recording errors had a randomness to them. They went in both directions, over and under, and they clustered around certain entry types where the math was more complicated. These 3 discrepancies were all in the same direction, all underreported on the bank side of the accounting, all within a 3-month window that corresponded, she now noticed, to a period when Gideon had been dealing with a cattle illness that had taken his attention entirely off the paperwork. Someone had been adjusting figures during a period when no one was watching. She closed the ledger, pressed her palms flat on the table, and sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the tin box again and went looking for the loan origination documents. She found them at the bottom, under a layer of older correspondence that smelled like dust and old ink. The original loan, taken out 8 years ago when the ranch was in better shape, had been signed by Gideon's father. She hadn't known the ranch had passed to Gideon through inheritance and filed that information away. The terms were standard, nothing remarkable, but stapled behind it was an amendment, dated 4 years ago. The amendment had Gideon's signature on it. She read the terms of the amendment 3 times. Then she set it on the table beside the bank letters and stared at the wall for a moment, because what she was reading meant that someone, either through Gideon's ignorance or his deliberate agreement, had restructured the loan in a way that made it nearly impossible to pay off within the original timeline. The interest had been altered, not dramatically, just enough. And the amendment included a clause, buried in the second paragraph, written in the smaller, denser font that contracts use when they want you to skip over something, that gave the lending bank the right to demand full repayment within 60 days if any portion of the collateral land was found to be an active legal dispute. Active legal dispute. Like, for instance, a water rights case that had been filed against Iron Mesa Ranch approximately 2 years ago. She pulled the water rights filings from the pile. She'd set them aside earlier because she hadn't understood their relevance yet, and checked the date. The legal filing had come 22 months ago. The bank's first demand letter had come 20 months ago, 2 months apart. Someone had triggered the legal dispute knowing exactly what clause it would activate. Someone who had known about that amendment, or someone who had caused it to exist in the first place. Vivian sat in the lamplight and felt the specific cold clarity that came over her when a pattern revealed itself. Not satisfaction, not yet. There was nothing satisfying about this, but the kind of focused, careful energy that a problem earns when it turns out to be real and serious and solvable, if you move correctly. She picked up her pencil and began making a timeline. She was still making it when the lamp burned out at 1 a.m, and she had to feel her way down the creaking hallway, stepping left as Mrs. Eula had told her, and go to bed in the dark with a head full of numbers and dates and the name Calvin Rourke written at the center of a diagram she hadn't finished yet. She slept for 4 hours. It felt like 2. Gideon was already at the table when she came out in the morning, drinking coffee and reading a week-old newspaper with the expression of a man who is reading to fill his hands rather than his mind. He looked up when she appeared, registered the fact that she had not slept enough, and poured her a cup of coffee without being asked. She sat down across from him and put her notes on the table between them. "I need you to tell me something honestly," she said. He set the newspaper down. "All right. The loan amendment, 4 years ago. Do you remember signing it?" His jaw shifted. Not a flinch exactly, but something tightened in the vicinity of his eyes. "I signed a lot of documents 4 years ago. My father had just died. The ranch was in bad shape, and I was trying to hold it together. Do you remember a man named—" She checked her notes. "A representative from Territorial Savings, a Mr. Aldous Fenn, coming to the ranch?" "Fenn." He said it slowly. "Once, maybe twice. He said the bank wanted to be helpful during the transition. He brought documents for you to sign." "He brought a lot of documents." Gideon's voice had gone careful, in the way that voices go careful when a person is starting to understand that something went wrong in a moment they thought they'd handled. "I read them." "Did you read the second paragraph of the amendment?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "Gideon." She kept her voice even, not accusatory. This wasn't about what he had failed to do 4 years ago in the middle of grief and exhaustion. "The amendment changed your loan terms and added a clause. If any portion of your collateral land enters active legal dispute, the bank can call the full loan within 60 days. He looked at her. The color in his face had changed slightly. Not pale, men like him didn't go pale, but something flatter and harder. "Say that again." She said it again. He stood up from the table, walked to the window, and stood with his back to her for long enough that she gave him the space to do it. The window faced east toward the barn, and the morning light was coming in sideways. Outside, she could hear Daniel moving around in the yard, doing some early chore. "The water rights case," he said finally, without turning around. "Filed 22 months ago. The bank's first demand letter came 20 months ago." She let him do the math. He turned around. His face had settled into something that wasn't anger exactly, or not only anger, it was the expression of a man who has been outsmarted and knows it and is deciding what to do with that knowledge rather than just feeling it. She found that more interesting than if he'd simply gotten loud. "Someone timed it," he said. "Yes." Rourke filed the water case knowing what it would trigger. "That's my current theory, but there's a step before that." She pulled the amendment to the front of her notes. "Someone had to know about the clause, which means either Rourke had access to your loan documents, or someone at the bank told him, or someone at the bank is directly connected to him." She watched his face. "Do you know if Rourke has any relationship with Territorial Savings?" Gideon came back to the table and sat down. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. "He's on the board," he said. "Or he was. A few years ago, someone mentioned it at the feed store. I didn't think much of it at the time." Vivian wrote that down. "So he had access to loan records," she said. "He saw the clause. And then he created the conditions to trigger it." She looked up. "The water dispute isn't about water." "Then what's it about?" "It's about forcing you into a loan default that makes your land legally vulnerable. If the bank calls the full loan and you can't pay, the land goes to auction. And if the land goes to auction while there's still an active legal dispute over the creek boundary, the value drops," Gideon said slowly. "Nobody bids on land with a water dispute attached to it. Nobody except the person who controls the dispute," Vivian said. "Who could drop it the moment he's the one who owns the land?" The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse made a sound and then was quiet again. Gideon put both hands flat on the table. His hands were shaking, very slightly, in a way she didn't think he was aware of. He's been planning this for years. At least 4, possibly longer. She gathered her notes into a neat stack. I need the survey maps, the original ones from the land grant, not the amended ones. And I need to know who did the most recent property survey on Rourke's land and when. I can find out about the survey. He looked at her. How do you know about all this? The question was genuine, not skeptical, more the honest bewilderment of someone watching a person do a thing they didn't know could be done. I spent 4 years managing records that other people ignored, she said. When you're the person who keeps the books that nobody else looks at, you start to understand the ways numbers can be made to lie. She picked up her coffee. And my father was cheated out of 120 acres when I was 9, by a man who knew exactly which documents to bury and which ones to wave around. I watched him fight it for 6 years and lose. She set the cup down. I've been reading this kind of story since I was a child. I just never had the chance to help change how it ended. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Not the sideways assessment from the wagon, something more direct, more considered. What do you need? He said. Time and access to whoever handles your legal filings. She paused. And I need you to stop signing documents from the bank until I've read them first. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Fair. I'm serious. I know you are. Now it was closer to a smile, brief and a little crooked. That's why I said fair. The first complication arrived 3 days later in the form of a rider. Vivian was in the back room, working her way through the survey maps with a lamp and a magnifying glass, and the focused intensity that Mrs. Eula had taken to referring to, not entirely approvingly, as that woman and her papers. She had the original land grant survey laid out flat under 2 books to keep it from rolling up, and she was comparing it line by line against the water rights filing when she heard the sound of a horse coming fast into the yard. She went to the window. The rider pulled up short outside the main barn, and from where she stood, Vivian could see it wasn't anyone she recognized. A young man, late 20s, wearing the kind of jacket that suggested he was someone's errand boy rather than a working hand. Gideon came out of the barn, and even from a distance she could read the body language. The way he went still when the man handed him an envelope. The way he stood after reading it, one hand at his side and one holding the letter, looking at nothing in particular. She was at the front door when he came in. He handed her the letter without being asked. It was from Territorial Savings. Formal language, official letterhead, the kind of typography that banks use when they want to convey that what they're saying is final and not open to interpretation. The loan was being formally called. Full repayment required within 60 days, per the terms of the amended agreement. Failure to comply would result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. At the bottom, a handwritten note from someone named Fletcher, senior manager, wishing Gideon the best in his future endeavors. The best in his future endeavors. 60 days, Gideon said. I know. We don't have... He stopped. I know. She folded the letter and held it. This is earlier than I expected. Someone knows we're looking. She thought about that for a moment. 3 days at the ranch. She hadn't left the property, hadn't contacted anyone. But the rider had come fast, which meant the letter had been sent quickly, which meant someone had made a decision to accelerate after... After what? Did anyone come to the ranch this week? She asked. Anyone you didn't expect? Gideon's expression shifted. Harlow Briggs was here 2 days ago. He runs the feed store. Said he was passing by. Does he usually pass by? Not often. Is he friendly with Rourke? Gideon said nothing, which was itself an answer. Vivian handed him the letter back. All right, she said. Then we move faster. What does that mean? It means I need to get to the county records office. She was already walking back to the survey maps. There's something in this original land grant that doesn't match the Rourke property line as filed. I've been trying to confirm it from what we have here, but I need the county copy. She looked up at him over the rolled maps. How far is it? County seat is Dalton. Day's ride. Can we go tomorrow? He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was recalibrating something about the situation, adjusting his understanding of what was actually happening here. We can go tomorrow, he said, and bring everything you have that shows your father's original boundaries, every piece, and don't tell anyone we're going. He didn't ask why. He nodded and went out to tell Daniel to check the wheel on the good wagon. Vivian turned back to the maps and kept working. She was building something. She could feel the shape of it, the way you can feel the shape of a room before your eyes adjust in the dark. Not clearly yet, not all the way, but enough to move without running into walls. The shape was a pattern, and the pattern had a center, and the center was a piece of land at the eastern edge of Iron Mesa Ranch that bordered the creek and also bordered what Calvin Rourke had been claiming for 2 years was his eastern property line. The question was whether the original survey agreed with Rourke's claim. She was beginning to strongly suspect it did not. That suspicion kept her up until nearly 2 in the morning when Mrs. Eula appeared in the doorway in a housecoat and said, with the flat practicality of a woman who has been managing other people's stubbornness for decades, "You'll ruin your eyes. The papers will still be wrong in the morning." Vivian looked up. "I'm almost—" "The papers," Mrs. Eula said, "will still be wrong in the morning." She set a glass of water on the edge of the table. "And you're no good to anyone if you can't see straight." Vivian looked at her. Then she looked at the magnifying glass in her hand and the lamp that had burned down to a level that actually was starting to make her eyes hurt. "Fine," she said. "Good." Mrs. Eula turned to go, then stopped. "You found something, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Vivian said. Mrs. Eula stood in the doorway for a moment, looking not at Vivian, but at some middle distance that seemed to contain something she was deciding whether to say. "His father was a good man," she said finally. "The ranch was good land. Whatever it looks like now, it was good land and good people, and someone broke it on purpose." She looked at Vivian then, directly. "I've been thinking that for 2 years. Didn't know what to do about it." Vivian held that carefully. "I'll tell you what I find," she said. Mrs. Eula nodded once, the particular nod of someone making a decision rather than acknowledging information. Then she went back down the hall, and Vivian sat for another moment in the low lamplight, with her hands folded on top of the survey maps, thinking about a good man's land and a broken ranch, and a woman who had been watching it happen for 2 years without the tools to stop it. She picked up the water glass, drank half of it, and went to bed with the timeline still running in her head. Sad. The road to Dalton was long and mostly empty, which suited Vivian because it gave her time to ask questions without the sound carrying. She had brought 2 things with her, the original land grant documents and a small notebook where she'd been writing her timeline in a hand so compressed it would have been nearly impossible for anyone else to read. She sat in the wagon with the notebook open on her knee and the documents in a satchel at her feet, and she asked Gideon about his father. Not because it was strictly relevant, partly because it was, and partly because she'd found, over 3 days at the ranch, that Gideon Mercer was a person who communicated a great deal through what he didn't say, and she was curious about the outline of the silences. His father, whose name had been Thomas, had built the ranch from nothing, not quite nothing, a land grant and a year's worth of supplies, but close enough. He'd spent 30 years making it into something that could sustain a family and eventually a crew. He'd died 2 years ago, a little before Vivian had expected given the way Gideon talked about it, and the manner of it had been the kind of ordinary tragedy that doesn't generate much sympathy because it lacks drama. Not an accident, not a fight, just a man who had worked very hard for a very long time and whose body eventually presented the bill. "He knew something was wrong," Gideon said, after a long pause that followed Vivian's careful question about the months before Thomas died. "He kept saying the books didn't add up. I thought he was—" He stopped. "Confused," Vivian said, not unkindly. "He was old. He was tired. I thought he was misremembering things." He was looking at the road ahead, and his jaw had the tension in it that it got when he was holding something down. Turns out he was the only one paying attention. What did he say exactly? That the numbers from the bank didn't match what he had, that someone was shaving figures. He paused. "I told him he'd probably made a mistake somewhere." Vivian thought about a man in his last years, watching the numbers he'd built his life on not add up, and his son telling him he'd probably made a mistake. She thought about what that felt like, and then she thought about what it felt like to have been wrong about something like that. "You didn't know," she said. "No." His voice was flat in a way that meant the flatness was doing a lot of work. "I didn't know." She didn't try to improve on that. There wasn't an improvement. She just wrote something in her notebook and let the wagon wheels do the talking for a mile. "The figures I found," she said eventually, "in the bank letters. Your father was right. Someone was adjusting numbers during periods when the ranch was distracted. The cattle illness 2 years ago, and before that the winter your fence line went down, and you were dealing with the county assessor." She looked at her notebook. Small amounts, spread out enough to look like clerical variants, big enough that over 4 years they total just over $900 of misrecorded debt that has been compounding at the amended interest rate. Gideon said nothing. "That's not the most important thing I found," she continued, "but it matters because it establishes a pattern and a timeline, and it connects to people who will need to be connected when this goes to a legal challenge." "When," he said. "Not if." He'd caught that. "When," she confirmed. He looked at her sideways. "You think we can win this?" "I think the evidence is there. Whether we can find all of it before 60 days is up is a different question." She closed the notebook. "But yes, I think we can win it." Something shifted in the way he was sitting, almost imperceptible, the kind of shift that happens when a person who has been braced for impact realizes the impact might not be as certain as they thought. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. Dalton came into view around midday, a proper county seat, 3 times the size of Red Bluff, with a courthouse that had ambitions above its actual quality. Vivian had him pull up 2 streets away from the records office and wait with the wagon while she went in alone. She had a reason for that. The records clerk was a man of perhaps 55, with the permanent squint of someone who spends most of his life reading small type in insufficient light. He looked up when she came in with the mild surprise that women in records offices still generated in certain parts of the country, and she gave him her most direct, unhurried look and asked to see the original property survey filings for Iron Mesa Ranch and the adjacent Rourke property going back to the land grant period. He blinked. Those are old filings." "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I'll wait." It took him 20 minutes to find them. She spent those 20 minutes standing exactly where she was and not showing any of the impatience she felt. Because clerks who feel rushed make mistakes and also become territorial about materials they might otherwise hand over without a second thought. When he came back with 2 rolled documents and a bound ledger, she thanked him with the particular warmth she kept in reserve for people who held information she needed and asked if she might use the table in the corner. He let her. She unrolled both surveys simultaneously, weighting the corners with the ledger and her notebook and 2 things from her bag, and she compared them side by side. It took her 4 minutes to find what she was looking for. The original land grant survey, the certified territorial copy, not the one from Gideon's tin box, but the official document bearing the land office seal, showed the eastern boundary of Iron Mesa Ranch running along the creek at a specific bearing that she'd written down from her work the night before. She'd memorized the number, 247 degrees southeast. The Rourke property survey, filed 6 years ago by a surveyor whose name she noted carefully, showed the adjacent boundary at 251 degrees. 4 degrees. In property surveying, 4 degrees over a line running 1.5 miles meant the encroachment wasn't a matter of a few feet. It was a matter of acres. Specifically, the acres that included the primary creek access point that had been at the center of the water rights dispute for 2 years. On the official territorial survey, those acres were Iron Mesa land. On the Rourke survey, the one that had been filed 6 years ago, the one that had become the basis for the water rights case, they were his. Someone had filed a survey with incorrect bearings, and either the county had never checked it against the original or someone had ensured it wasn't checked. She sat very still for a moment, looking at the 2 lines on the 2 maps. Then she asked the clerk very calmly if she might have certified copies of both documents. He looked at her with the mild suspicion that official requests from women without obvious legal authority generated in certain records offices, and she looked back at him with a calm and specific patience that communicated, without saying so directly, that she was going to be sitting in this chair waiting for however long it took. He made the copies. She paid the fee, thanked him again, rolled the copies carefully, and slid them into the satchel and walked out of the records office into the afternoon sun of Dalton with the steadiness of someone who has just found the thread that unravels everything and knows they cannot afford to pull it too fast. Gideon was where she'd left him, 2 streets over, sitting on the wagon with the horses tied, and a patience that she was coming to understand was not passivity, but something harder. The particular endurance of a man who has learned to wait because the alternative is burning everything down. She climbed up beside him, put the satchel on her lap. "Did you find something?" he asked. "The property survey Rourke filed 6 years ago has incorrect bearings," she said, "by 4 degrees. The creek access point, the land at the center of the water dispute, is on your side of the line. On the original territorial survey, it's clearly Iron Mesa land." She pressed her hand flat on the satchel. "He didn't file a water rights dispute because he thinks that land is his. He filed it because he knew the survey discrepancy would create enough legal ambiguity to trigger your loan clause, depress your land value, and position him to buy you out at auction." Gideon sat with that for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "He moved the line. His surveyor moved the line 6 years ago, before the legal trouble started, before the loan amendment, possibly, which means the whole sequence was planned from the beginning." She looked at him. "I have certified copies. They're admissible, but we need to establish who commissioned the survey and whether it can be proven the discrepancy was deliberate rather than an error." "How do we do that?" "We find the original surveyor and we find out who paid him." She paused. "And we do it before Rourke realizes what I found today." The wagon started moving. The copies were in her satchel, and the satchel was on her lap, and Vivian kept her hand on it the entire way back to Red Bluff, the way you keep your hand on something that took a long time to find and that you cannot afford to lose. Gideon drove without speaking for several miles. When he did speak, it was without preamble, in the way that his most considered statements always came, without announcement, just the thing itself. "You could have taken those copies and left," he said. "Taken them somewhere. Used them yourself somehow. I wouldn't have known." Vivian looked at him. "What would I do with them?" "I don't know. But you could have." A pause. "I'm saying I noticed you didn't." She thought about that for a moment. The specific kind of trust that had to be built in the wreckage of broken arrangements, and the gap left by people who had not done what they said they would. The way Gideon Mercer was trying to say something about it without quite having the vocabulary for it yet. "The land is yours," she said. "Those documents belong to the case that proves it. Taking them would be theft." "I know. I'm still—" He stopped, tried again. "Thank you. That's what I'm saying." She nodded once and looked back at the road. The sun was getting low, and the ride back to Iron Mesa was still long, and she had a surveyor's name written in her notebook and 48 days left on a 60-day foreclosure clock. She had work to do. The surveyor's name was Clement Hask. Vivian found it on the filing stamp at the bottom of the Rourke property survey. Small print, easy to miss. The kind of professional signature that blends into the document until you're looking for it specifically. She'd written it in her notebook on the wagon ride back from Dalton and spent the following morning asking careful, indirect questions about him at the feed store, while Gideon purchased supplies and kept his expression deliberately neutral. What she learned was this. Clement Hask had worked out of a town called Faro, 20 miles southeast of Red Bluff, for approximately 12 years. He'd done survey work across 3 counties, had a decent enough reputation, and had stopped working about 14 months ago. Nobody at the feed store knew exactly why. One man thought he'd moved on to another territory. Another thought he'd had some kind of health trouble. A third, an older hand named Cully, who had been leaning on a fence post outside and appeared to have no particular destination, said he'd heard Hask had come into some money and retired early. Come into some money. Vivian thanked Cully for his time and walked back to the wagon with the careful, unhurried step of someone filing information that will need to be retrieved later. Hask retired 14 months ago, she told Gideon when they were clear of the store. 14 months ago is 2 months after the water rights case was filed and 8 months after the bank sent the first demand letter. Gideon thought about that. Paid off and cleared out. That's my read. She put her notebook away. But cleared out doesn't mean gone. It means he went somewhere he thought was far enough. She looked at the road ahead. People who take money to do something they know is wrong usually don't go very far. They go just far enough to feel safe, and then they stop. Because starting over somewhere completely new takes a kind of courage that the kind of person who takes that money generally doesn't have. That's a specific theory. I've thought about it a lot, she said, and left it at that. They had 46 days left. She made a list of what still needed to happen and the sequence in which it needed to happen, and the list was long enough that she tore the page from her notebook and rewrote it twice to make sure the order was right. Finding Hask was third on the list, after two things that could be done from the ranch without exposing their hand. She wasn't ready to go looking for a man who had been paid to disappear until she had everything else in order, because if Hask heard someone was asking questions, and he was still connected to Rourke's operation in any way, she'd lose the element she needed most. The element she needed most was that Calvin Rourke did not yet know what she'd found in Dalton. She intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. The first thing on the list was the financial discrepancies. She needed to document everyone she'd found in the bank records in a format that was legible to someone outside the ranch, a clear accounting, with dates and amounts and corresponding ledger entries that showed the pattern of misrecorded debt. This wasn't evidence she could take to a court directly, but it was evidence she could use to force a conversation with someone at the bank who wasn't connected to Rourke. The key was finding that person. The key was finding out whether Aldous Fenn, the man who had brought the loan amendment to Gideon's table 4 years ago while he was grieving and exhausted, was acting on Rourke's instruction or on his own initiative, and whether anyone else at Territorial Savings was aware of what had been done. Banks had enemies within themselves, same as everywhere else. Vivian had learned this in Philadelphia, managing books for people who needed the services of multiple financial institutions. The person at the top of a bank and the person who processed the daily records were rarely working toward the same goals. And people who processed records tended to notice things that people at the top preferred they didn't notice. She spent 3 days on the financial documentation. She worked at the table every morning and evening, and during the middle hours of the day she helped with whatever needed doing on the ranch, not because Gideon asked her to, but because she found that sitting still for too many hours with numbers made her brain loop the same paths over and over, and physical work broke the circuit. She helped Mrs. Eula with the kitchen garden, pulling out what had gone to seed and turning the soil where it had gone hard. She fixed a fence post near the main gate that was listing badly and would eventually go down on its own. She sat with Daniel one afternoon and helped him work through an arithmetic problem he'd been avoiding, and discovered that the boy had a sharp, quick mind that nobody had been paying enough attention to. "You do this kind of math at school?" she asked him. He shrugged with the elaborate indifference of a 12-year-old who doesn't want to admit that something interests him. "Sometimes." "Do you like it?" Another shrug. "Daniel." He looked at her sideways, suspicious of the directness. "It's fine," he said. "Because if you like it," she said, continuing as if he hadn't answered, "I have a primer that goes past what they're likely teaching you. You could borrow it." He didn't say yes. He also didn't say no, which in 12-year-old language was approximately the same as asking when he could start. She left the primer on the kitchen table that evening and didn't make anything of it, and the next morning it was gone from the table and she didn't comment on that either. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he was watching her differently by the end of that week. Not the careful, guarded assessment of the first days, when he was still deciding whether she was what she appeared to be, but something more settled, like a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. She noticed him noticing and kept her thoughts about that organized in a compartment that was not immediately relevant to the 60-day clock. On the fourth day, the second thing on her list, she needed to find the original notes from the water rights filing, specifically the complaint document that Rourke's lawyer had filed with the territorial court, and identify the legal argument being made about the property boundary. If the argument cited the Hask survey directly, she needed to know that. If it cited a different document, she needed to know that too, because it would either mean there was additional falsified evidence she hadn't found yet, or it would mean the case rested on something even shakier than she thought. The territorial court records were in Dalton, and she couldn't go back to Dalton again so soon without it potentially getting back to Rourke. She needed someone else to go, someone without any visible connection to Iron Mesa Ranch, someone who could access public records without generating comment. She thought about this for most of a morning, and then she asked Gideon if he trusted his nearest neighbor, a rancher to the north named Pete Aldred, who had apparently been on friendly terms with the Mercer family for 20 years. Gideon thought about it. "I trust him," he said. "He's not... Pete minds his own business. He doesn't talk." "Does he go to Dalton regularly?" "He's got a daughter there, visits about once a month." "When is he due to go next?" As it happened, Pete Aldred was going to Dalton in 4 days. Gideon rode over that afternoon and came back 2 hours later and told Vivian that Pete would look at whatever she needed looked at, and he hadn't asked why, and he told Gideon that if Calvin Rourke was involved, he was glad to help because Rourke's fence crew had damaged 30 feet of his own north pasture line 2 years ago, and the man had never offered a dime toward repairs. Vivian wrote down what she needed Pete to find, gave Gideon the page to take back, and moved to the third thing on her list, the letters. Going through the correspondence in the tin box had given her the bank side of the financial picture, but she needed the other correspondence, the letters to and from the Territorial Land Office, the Water Court, and anyone who had weighed in on the boundary question officially. Gideon had 3 letters from a land office representative named Hoskins, and all 3 were technically neutral but had a specific quality she'd noticed in legal documents designed to appear neutral while steering toward a predetermined conclusion. The language was too precise in certain places, too vague in others. The vagueness always appeared wherever specificity might have created a clear counterargument. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office requesting the complete file on the Iron Mesa Ranch Boundary Survey under the historical grant provisions. She wrote it in the formal, technically accurate language of someone who understood exactly which regulatory framework applied, because she had learned that official offices respond differently to requests that demonstrate institutional literacy. If you write as someone who doesn't quite know the terminology, you get sent a form. If you write as someone who clearly knows the process and is citing specific provisions, you get the actual file. She gave the letter to Gideon to mail from town and told him to use the post office at the east end of Main Street rather than the one near the saloon, because the postmaster at the saloon end had a wife who talked, and the wife talked to people whose names were starting to appear on Vivian's timeline in uncomfortable proximity to Calvin Rourke. "You know about the postmaster's wife?" Gideon said. "Mrs. Eula told me." He looked toward the kitchen with an expression that suggested Mrs. Eula had been considerably more forthcoming with Vivian in 2 weeks than she had been with him in 2 years. "What else did she tell you?" he asked. "Enough," Vivian said. "She's been watching this town for decades. People stop noticing someone who's been in the background long enough." He took the letter to town. He used the East Post Office. Pete Aldred's report came back from Dalton 8 days later, delivered by Pete's son-in-law, who happened to be going through Red Bluff on other business. It was written in the plain, unadorned hand of a man who had been asked to copy down specific information and had done exactly that without embellishment. The water rights complaint cited 3 documents: the Hask survey, a creek flow assessment from 2 years ago, and a statement from a territorial water official named Griggs, who had visited the Iron Mesa Rourke boundary at Rourke's request, and noted in his official record that the boundary as shown on the Rourke survey appeared consistent with the surrounding land features. Appeared consistent. Vivian sat with that phrase for a moment. Not is consistent, not confirmed, appeared consistent, which was the official language of a man who had looked at one survey, confirmed that the land in front of him looked like the land described on that survey, and not bothered to check whether the survey itself was accurate. She circled Griggs's name. Then she looked at the creek flow assessment. It had been commissioned by Rourke and conducted by a firm in the county seat. She needed to know if that firm had any financial relationship with Rourke beyond this single engagement. She added it to the list. 31 days left. She was sitting at the table doing the math on what remained when Gideon came in from the evening round with his hat in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not troubled exactly, complicated in a way that suggested he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. She waited. "Rourke came to the north fence today," he said. She put her pencil down. "Did he?" "Not through the gate. Through the field. Him and 2 of his men just came up to the fence line and stood there." He set his hat on the side table. "He looked at the house for a while. Then he looked at me. He didn't say anything. Then he left. She held that for a moment. He was sending a message. Yes. He knows something's changed. He doesn't know what yet, or he'd have done more than stand at a fence. She picked up her pencil. We've got maybe 2 weeks before he gets specific about what we're doing. After that, he'll start trying to interfere more directly. What does more directly look like? Legal delays? Challenging our access to records? Possibly trying to get our copies of the Dalton surveys questioned on a technicality. She paused. Or he goes around the legal approach and applies pressure another way, to people we're relying on. Gideon understood immediately. Pete. Anyone else we've contacted, we need to be careful about who knows what from here on. She looked at him. Is there anyone in Red Bluff? Someone with legal standing, a lawyer, a justice of the peace, someone with official capacity who isn't connected to Rourke's money, who could receive what we have and begin a formal challenge? He thought about it. There's a man named Harlan Webb. He's a solicitor, not a full attorney. He handles wills and property transfers mostly. Rourke doesn't use him. Rourke uses a firm out of the capital. He paused. Webb's an honest man. He won't be able to fight Rourke's lawyers on their level, but I don't need him to fight, Vivian said. I need him to file. Once a formal challenge is filed with the territorial court citing the survey discrepancy and requesting a boundary review, Rourke can't quietly make the water case go away without it looking like he had reason to drop it. She stood up. Can we see Webb tomorrow morning? I can have him at the ranch by 9. Good. She picked up the certified copies from the Dalton trip, still in their careful order, and took them to the back room to add the new information from Pete's report. And Gideon, don't tell him what it's about when you ask him. Just ask him to come. Harlan Webb arrived at 9:15 the following morning, a slight man in his 60s with a careful, watchful manner and the slightly apologetic air of a person who has spent a career being the smallest presence in rooms that contained larger personalities. He sat down at the table with his hat on his knee and looked at the documents Vivian set in front of him with the particular alertness that careful people have when they're presented with something that might require them to be braver than they'd planned. She walked him through it without editorializing. The certified original survey, the Rourke survey with the 4-degree bearing discrepancy, the timeline of the loan amendment and the water rights filing and the bank demand letter, the financial discrepancies in the bank records. She spoke precisely and didn't over-explain and answered his questions directly. Webb asked good questions. He asked them in a specific order that told her he understood property law better than she'd expected from Gideon's description of a man who handled wills and transfers. When she finished, he sat for a long moment with his hands folded and his eyes on the documents. The survey discrepancy is real, he said. It wasn't a question. The certified copies are right there, she said. I see them. He was quiet again. This isn't... He stopped, started again. Miss Hale, what you're describing is a coordinated effort involving at minimum a falsified survey, a loan officer who may have structured documents to benefit a third party, and a water rights filing built on the falsified survey. That's not a property dispute. That's fraud. Yes, she said. I file property challenges. I'm not a fraud litigator. I know. But you can file a boundary review challenge with the territorial court. That's within your capacity. And once that's filed, the water rights case becomes legally complicated for Rourke to pursue, which buys time. She looked at him steadily. The fraud case needs someone with more authority than any of us have right now. But if we get to the territorial court first with the survey evidence, we force the boundary question into the official record. Then we take the financial evidence to someone who can investigate the bank involvement. Webb looked at Gideon, who had been sitting to the side through all of this, saying very little. You understand what happens if Rourke decides to push back on this directly, Webb said. He has resources. He has connections. He has a law firm at the Capitol that I cannot match. I know, Gideon said. This will get difficult. It's already difficult, Gideon said. I've got 24 days left on a 60-day foreclosure notice and a water case I didn't cause on my land I've had for 30 years. It doesn't get more difficult than this. Webb looked down at the documents again. Then he did something she hadn't entirely expected. He straightened in his chair, the apologetic quality in his manner going somewhat more upright, like a man remembering something about himself. "I'll need certified copies of the surveys and the loan amendment," he said. "And your timeline, Miss Hale, written out clearly." "I have copies ready," she said. She'd prepared them the night before. Webb filed the challenge 4 days later. Vivian didn't go to Dalton for the filing. She stayed at the ranch and let Webb and Gideon handle it, because she needed to find Clement Hask, and she needed to do it before Rourke's people made the connection between the Dalton filing and the survey and went looking for Hask themselves. She found him through a chain of inquiries that took most of a week and involved 3 letters sent to different addresses across 2 counties. Written under a false name, she'd chosen specifically because it sounded like a property investor, rather than a woman connected to Iron Mesa Ranch. She was looking for survey work in the region and had been given his name as someone who had done precise work in the area. She was interested in retaining his services. The 3rd letter got a response. Clement Hask was in a town called Veda's Crossing, 40 miles east. He was not, apparently, as retired as the Red Bluff gossip suggested. He was doing small-scale residential work, the kind that didn't attract much notice, under a shortened version of his name. He wrote back cautiously, asking for more information about the property in question. She wrote back with enough specificity to keep him interested and enough vagueness to require a meeting. She said she preferred to discuss the details in person, given the sensitivity of the work. She gave him the name of a hotel in a town called Millrace, which was between Veda's Crossing and Red Bluff, but connected to neither in any obvious way, and suggested a Thursday. He agreed to Thursday. She told Gideon the night before she was going. He didn't like it. She could see that clearly, the way his jaw set and the way he looked at the table instead of at her, which was what he did when he had something to say that he hadn't decided whether to say. "It's a long ride alone," he said finally. 40 miles. 38 to Millrace, she said. "I've ridden longer." "You've ridden—" He stopped. "You know how to handle a horse?" "I grew up on a farm until I was 12, she said. "I know how to handle a horse." He looked up at her. "And if Hask talks to someone before you get there? If Rourke's people are watching him? Then I'll learn that when I get there, and I'll leave without getting what I need." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. "But I don't think they're watching him. If they were watching him, they'd have cleaned him up more thoroughly when the Dalton filing was made. He's still there. That means Rourke doesn't think anyone's found the survey discrepancy yet." "The filing is public record now," Gideon said. "Someone will connect it." "Yes, which is why I'm going Thursday and not waiting." She looked at him. "I need you here. If someone comes to the ranch while I'm gone, I need you to be here, and to be calm, and to not show them anything." "Who would come?" "Rourke's men. Possibly someone from the bank. Possibly someone we haven't thought of yet." She paused. "If anyone asks where I am, tell them I went to visit a cousin in the North County. Tell it like it's dull." He held her eyes for a long moment. Then, "Take the gray mare. She's faster than she looks, and she doesn't spook." She took the gray mare. Millrace was a small town that existed primarily because a road crossed a creek there, and someone had put a hotel on the corner 30 years ago out of optimism. The hotel was still standing, which was about the best that could be said for it. The dining room smelled like boiled cabbage and old wood and the particular mustiness of a space that wasn't well ventilated, and the tables were covered in oilcloth that had been wiped down recently enough to still be damp. Vivian was there 40 minutes before Hask, which she had planned. She ordered coffee and sat facing the door and composed her expression into the pleasant, slightly distracted look of a woman waiting for a business meeting she considers routine. He came in at 12 minutes past the agreed time, which told her something. Late enough to have thought about whether to come at all. Not late enough to have actually decided against it. Clement Hask was in his mid-50s, stocky, with the calloused hands of someone who had done actual field work rather than merely supervising it. He looked around the room when he came in with the quick visual sweep of a person accustomed to checking who was present before committing to a space. She raised her hand slightly, a minimal signal, and he came over. "Miss Alderman," he said, using the false name from her letter. "Mr. Hask, thank you for making the trip." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit down." He sat. He didn't remove his hat. She noted that the hat staying on was either a social habit or a readiness to leave quickly, and she wasn't yet sure which. "The property you mentioned in the letter," he said. "You said it was east of Red Bluff territory?" "Yes," she said. "I'm interested in a survey of land in that general area. Before I retain anyone, I like to understand the prior work that's been done in the region." She folded her hands on the table. "You worked out there a few years ago, I understand, on the Rourke property boundary?" Something moved through his face. Not panic, closer to the particular stillness of a man who has just realized the ground has shifted under the conversation. "Where did you hear that?" he said. "The filing is public record," she said simply. He looked at his hands. He had a coffee cup in front of him that he hadn't touched. "That was a standard survey job," he said. "Routine boundary work." "The bearing on the eastern line," she said, keeping her voice conversational, nearly pleasant. 251 degrees, that would put the creek access on the Rourke side. That's where it falls. The original territorial land grant survey shows that same line at 247 degrees. She watched his face. "I have certified copies from the county records in Dalton. The original surveyor's notes are attached. 4 degrees is not a measurement error, Mr. Hask. That's outside any reasonable margin for the equipment available at the time." He was very still now. The coffee cup was still untouched. Outside, a horse went past on the street, and neither of them looked at the window. "I don't know what you're suggesting," he said. "I'm suggesting you know exactly what I'm suggesting," she said. "And I'm telling you that a formal boundary challenge has already been filed with the territorial court citing the discrepancy. The water rights case built on your survey is now going to be reviewed against the original land grant documents." She paused. "I am not here as anyone's legal representative. I am here because I think you went along with something because you were paid to and because someone told you it was untraceable, and I think you have spent the 14 months since you took that money understanding that it was not as untraceable as you were told." The silence that followed was of a particular quality, not the silence of denial, but the silence of a person deciding something. His jaw moved. He looked at the window once, the real checking look, and then he looked back at her. If someone were to... He stopped. If certain information were provided, voluntary, not forced, not court-ordered, he said it carefully, each word placed deliberately. "What happens to the person who provides it?" "I can't make legal promises," she said. "I'm not a lawyer, but voluntary disclosure that helps establish how a fraud was structured typically looks very different to investigators than information dragged out in court." She held his eyes. "You didn't design what happened. You were the instrument of it. That's not the same thing as the person who paid you." His hands, both of them now flat on the oilcloth, were trembling slightly. Not dramatically. The small, uncontrolled tremor of a man whose body was expressing something he was trying to keep out of his face. "He told me the original survey had an error," Hask said. His voice had gone quieter. "He showed me documentation. Said there was a historical mistake in the original filing, that the bearing had been wrong since the land grant and nobody had caught it. He said he was just correcting the record." He looked down at the table. "He paid me what I would have made in 6 months in 2 weeks. And he said the original survey documents had been mishandled and the Territorial Records Office had confirmed the error. And you didn't check." He stopped. "I should have checked." "Yes," she said, not unkindly but without softening it. "You should have." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "The documentation he showed me. I kept a copy. I don't know why. I should have thrown it away." He looked up at her. "I didn't throw it away." Vivian kept her face even. Inside, something that had been held tightly for 3 weeks released slightly, the way a bowstring releases when the arrow finally goes. "I would very much like to see those documents," she said. He pulled a folded envelope from inside his jacket. She hadn't seen it when he came in, which meant he'd had it there already, which meant he'd been deciding whether to produce it before he'd even sat down. He set it on the table between them. She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at him first. "You understand what this does," she said. "Yes," he said. "Whatever prompted you to keep it," she began. "I'm not a criminal," he said. It came out rougher than his previous measured sentences. "I was a fool, and I was greedy, and I needed the money, and I told myself it was a technical correction, and none of those things make me right. But I'm not..." He stopped. I have a son in Faro. He wants to be a land surveyor. She held that carefully. Then she picked up the envelope. Inside was a letter on Rourke's personal stationery, hand-signed, outlining the survey correction, citing a document that Vivian had already confirmed did not exist in the official record, and authorizing payment in specific cash amounts on specific dates. Calvin Rourke had signed his own name to a document commissioning a falsified survey. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough to read it twice and confirm that what she was reading was what she thought she was reading. Then she folded it back into the envelope very carefully, the way you handle something that took 14 months to find its way to the right table, and she said to Clement Hask, "I need you to be willing to provide an affidavit, your account of what happened, attached to this letter." He closed his eyes for a moment, then he opened them. "Tell me what to write." She ordered more coffee. She took out her notebook. Outside, the afternoon was moving forward in the unhurried way of small towns that don't know they're on the edge of something, and Vivian Hale sat in a damp-smelling hotel dining room in Millrace and began, very carefully, to build the thing that would finally bring Calvin Rourke down. She had 17 days left on the clock. It was enough. She rode back to Iron Mesa in the dark. Not by choice, she'd planned to leave Millrace by mid-afternoon and be home before supper, but the affidavit had taken longer than expected. Hask was a careful man, even now, even doing the right thing, and he wanted every sentence read back to him before he'd sign it. She didn't rush him. Rushing a man in the middle of deciding to tell the truth was the fastest way to make him change his mind, and she needed his account solid and complete and signed in a way that couldn't later be characterized as coerced or confused. They'd finished at 6:30. She'd thanked him, given him Harlan Webb's name and address, and told him that when investigators came, and she said when, not if, because she wanted him to understand the direction this was moving, his cooperation would already be on record. She'd left him sitting at the table with a fresh cup of coffee and the particular hollowed-out expression of a man who has put down something heavy and isn't yet sure how to stand without it. The envelope with Rourke's letter was in her satchel, against her side, under her arm, in a position she was aware of continuously for every one of the 38 miles back to Iron Mesa. The gray mare was indeed faster than she looked. Gideon had been right about that. She was also, as he'd said, calm, the kind of horse that moved through the dark without drama, picking her footing carefully and not spooking at the night sounds that came out of the scrub brush along the road. Vivian was grateful for the calmness. Her own mind was anything but calm. It was running the sequence over and over, what she had, what it meant, what needed to happen next and in what order, and the rhythm of the mare's stride was the only thing keeping the running from becoming frantic. Rourke's letter changed everything, and it changed everything in a way that was genuinely dangerous. Before the letter, she'd had evidence of a pattern, discrepancies that suggested fraud, survey documents that showed a bearing error, a timeline that implied coordination. All of it compelling, all of it pointing in the same direction, but nothing that put Rourke's own hand directly on the mechanism. Defense lawyers ate pattern evidence for breakfast when there was no direct document. Now she had a direct document. A letter in Calvin Rourke's handwriting, on his stationery, with his signature, commissioning a survey he'd told the surveyor would correct a historical error, citing a document that didn't exist. That document transformed every other piece of evidence she'd gathered from implication into corroboration. It didn't just suggest Rourke had orchestrated the fraud. It proved he had initiated it. That was why it was dangerous. A man who would spend 4 years engineering the quiet financial destruction of a neighboring ranch to steal its land was not a man who would accept discovery calmly. He had resources. He had connections at the Capitol. He had a law firm and a bank board seat and a network of people whose prosperity depended on his continued influence. The moment he understood what she had, he would come at it with everything available to him, and the first thing he would try to do was discredit the source. That meant Vivian. She thought about that clearly, without flinching from it, the way you think about a physical obstacle you're going to have to go around. He would try to make the case that she was motivated by something other than the truth, that she was acting in bad faith, that she had manipulated Hask, that she had manufactured or altered the documents she was presenting. He couldn't disprove the certified copies from Dalton because those had come from the official county record and carried the clerk's seal, but he could attack her credibility, her motives, her position, a mail-order bride who'd been rejected on the platform, who had gone home with a struggling rancher the same day, who had no official standing at Iron Mesa Ranch, no legal relationship to Gideon Mercer, no formal authorization to access his records or conduct investigations on his behalf. She could see the argument already, could hear it in the smooth, practiced voice of a capital law firm. This woman arrived in Red Bluff with nothing, attached herself to a failing ranch, and is now presenting a manufactured story to prevent a legitimate legal proceeding from running its course. She had to get ahead of it. The house was dark when she came into the yard, except for a single lamp in the main room. She put the mare in the barn, properly, with water and feed, not just a quick tie, and went inside. Gideon was at the table. He'd been waiting, which she could tell from the way the lamp had burned down and from the coffee cup in front of him that had gone cold. He looked up when she came in, and the specific quality of his relief, the kind that comes from the release of several hours of held concern, was visible enough that she felt something shift slightly in her own chest. She sat down across from him and put the satchel on the table. "I have it," she said. She took out the envelope and laid Rourke's letter flat between them. He read it. She watched him read it. His face went through several things in the space of 30 seconds. Recognition, then a kind of cold fury that he controlled almost immediately, then something harder and more deliberate underneath the control. "His signature," Gideon said. "His signature," she confirmed. "He signed his own name to the document that—" He stopped. He was that certain nobody would find it. He was certain Hask would dispose of it. He didn't count on Hask being a man who kept things he was afraid of. She folded her hands on the table. "We have the letter, Hask's signed affidavit explaining the context, the certified surveys from Dalton, the financial discrepancy documentation, and the timeline connecting the loan amendment to the water rights filing to the bank demand letter." She paused. "It's enough for a formal fraud investigation, but we have 15 days left on the foreclosure clock, and a fraud investigation takes time we don't have." Gideon was quiet, thinking, what do? We go to two places simultaneously. We go to Harlan Webb with everything, and we ask him to file an emergency motion to stay the foreclosure proceedings pending the fraud investigation. If the court agrees there's sufficient evidence of fraud connected to the loan's triggering conditions, they can pause the 60-day clock. She straightened the letter on the table. "And we contact whoever at Territorial Savings is not connected to Rourke and show them this. Because a bank that has been used as an instrument of fraud has very strong motivation to distance itself from that fraud before the investigation makes the connection public." Gideon looked at her. "You think there's someone at the bank who doesn't know?" "I think there are people at the bank who process the daily records and noticed things that didn't add up and kept their heads down because that's what you do when a board member is involved," she said. "I think if one of those people were approached correctly, they might be willing to talk." She paused. "Do you know anyone who works at Territorial Savings? Not a manager. Someone in the records department." He thought about it. "There's a woman, Margaret Toll. She handled my father's accounts for years. I haven't spoken to her since he died. Would she remember you?" "She came to the funeral," he said quietly. Vivian nodded. "Then you should go see her." She said it gently because she understood that the funeral was not a neutral reference, that it contained things she hadn't been present for and didn't fully know. She watched him absorb it and put it away in the way that he put difficult things, which was not denial but a particular kind of management, the same way you manage something heavy by redistributing the weight rather than pretending it isn't heavy. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow." Mrs. Eula appeared in the hallway at that point, which told Vivian she had also been waiting, not at the table, because that would have been too obvious, but nearby. She looked at the letter on the table, looked at Vivian, and said, with the directness that was her consistent mode, "You got what you went for." "Yes," Vivian said. Mrs. Eula nodded once. Then, "There's food in the kitchen. Eat before you sleep." She went back down the hall. Vivian ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her, and then she was very hungry. The specific hollow appetite of someone who has spent a full day running on concentration alone. She sat at the kitchen table and ate, and Gideon sat across from her and didn't talk much, which she had come to understand was not distance, but a form of presence, the specific company of someone who knew that the moment didn't require filling. When she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came, running the sequence. 15 days. Webb and the emergency stay motion. Gideon and Margaret Toll. The territorial court and whatever investigative arm the fraud evidence would eventually reach. The harvest festival was in 11 days. She knew this from Mrs. Eula, who had mentioned it in the context of needing to order preserves, an entirely practical concern that had nothing to do with what Vivian was now thinking, which was that a harvest festival meant the entire community in one place, which meant Calvin Rourke in one place, which meant something, though she wasn't sure yet what. She slept eventually. The sequence kept running in the background of her sleep, turning itself over like a wheel. The visit to Harlan Webb the next morning was the smoothest part of what followed, which she had expected. Webb was a man who became more competent when the material warranted it, and the material they brought him warranted it considerably. He read Rourke's letter with the careful attention he'd given the surveys, asked 3 precise questions, and then said he would file the emergency stay motion by end of day. "The court will ask for a response from the bank," he said, "which means Rourke will know by tomorrow that the motion has been filed." "I know," Vivian said. "Once he knows—" "I know," she said again. "File it anyway." Webb looked at Gideon, who nodded. Webb filed it. The visit to Margaret Toll was harder. Gideon came back from town at noon with a carefully composed expression that told Vivian it had not gone the way he'd hoped before he said a word. "She knows something," he said, sitting down. "I could see it in her. But she wouldn't say it directly. She just kept saying she hoped everything worked out, and that she was sorry about the loan situation, and that the bank had been going through a lot of changes." He looked at his hands, and then she said, almost like an accident, like she was saying something else. She said the original loan files from the last 4 years were kept separately from the standard filing system. She said it was a new protocol for certain account types. He paused. Then she looked away. Like she'd said something she hadn't meant to. Vivian sat with that. Separately filed, meaning they're not in the general records that would be subject to a standard audit. That's how it sounded to me. So if the discrepancies were found in a general audit, they'd be missed. But she knows where they are. Vivian pressed her thumb against the table's edge, thinking. She's telling you something. She's just not saying it directly because saying it directly risks her position. She has 3 children, Gideon said. Her husband died 2 years ago. Vivian understood. A woman with 3 children and no husband and a job at a bank where a board member had been using the institution for fraud. You didn't take risks with that situation unless you were given a very good reason to believe the risk was worthwhile. I need to talk to her, Vivian said. Not at the bank, somewhere else. She goes to the market on Thursdays. Can you get word to her? Not in writing. In person, through someone she trusts. Gideon thought about it. Pete Aldred's daughter knows her. They go to the same, they're acquainted. Ask Pete's daughter to tell her that the person working on the Iron Mesa situation would like to meet her Thursday at the market. Tell her it's her choice entirely. Tell her no one will ask her to do anything she's not comfortable with. He sent word through Pete Aldred's daughter that afternoon. The next 3 days were the closest thing to waiting that Vivian had experienced since arriving in Red Bluff, and she was not good at waiting. She filled it with work, the legitimate ranch work that had been accumulating while her attention was on the legal investigation. The financial records, now fully documented, needed to be organized into a clean presentation format. The ranch's actual ongoing accounts needed attention. She found 3 places where costs could be reduced without affecting the operation, and one where Gideon had been overpaying a supplier by 10% because nobody had renegotiated the price in 4 years. She fixed both. She also had a long conversation with Daniel, who had returned the arithmetic primer with 3 pages of problems completed in a hand that was trying very hard to be neat and mostly succeeding. She gave him more problems and told him he was good at this, which she would not have said if it wasn't true. She didn't believe in telling children they were good at things they weren't good at, because the world would correct that impression soon enough, and the correction was always harder when it came late. Daniel received the information with the 11-year-old's studied indifference that she now understood meant he'd heard it and filed it somewhere important. On the second day, two things happened. The first was that Harlan Webb sent a note saying the court had received the emergency stay motion and that Rourke's legal representatives had already filed an objection, which meant Rourke knew, which meant the clock on whatever he would try to do next had started. The second was that 3 of Rourke's men rode past the Iron Mesa gate at midday, not stopping, not engaging, just riding slowly enough that the riding was clearly intentional. Daniel saw them from the yard and came inside and told Vivian with the flat factual delivery of a boy who understood more about what was happening than the adults had told him. 3 riders, he said. The one in front had a rifle across his saddle. Vivian thanked him and went to find Gideon. They discussed it without alarm, but without dismissing it either. The two of them at the table, in the straightforward way they'd developed for discussing things that required clarity rather than reassurance. "He's not going to burn the barn," Gideon said. "He's too careful for that. Anything that obvious becomes evidence." "He's making sure we're nervous," Vivian agreed. "He wants us to make a mistake. File something incorrectly. Retract something. Reach out to the wrong person." She paused. "We don't make a mistake." "We don't make a mistake," he said. She looked at him across the table and something passed between them that was not about the case. A brief, specific acknowledgement of the situation they were both in, which was that they had built something in the last 3 weeks that neither of them had planned to build, and that the building of it had happened in the background of everything else, without announcement or ceremony, the way things grow when you're too busy surviving to watch them. She looked away first, back to the papers. "Thursday," she said. Margaret Toll was at the market at 8 in the morning, the way women with jobs and 3 children are at the market, efficiently, purposefully, with a list that she was working through in order. She was perhaps 45 with careful eyes and the composed manner of someone who had learned that composure was a resource and spent it carefully. Vivian had come to the market ostensibly to buy flour and dried beans. She positioned herself near the flour and waited for Margaret to come to her, because making a woman walk across a space to a meeting, she was nervous about announcing the meeting to everyone nearby. Margaret came to the flour. "Mrs. Toll," Vivian said quietly. "Miss Hale." She didn't look directly at Vivian. She was reading the label on a flour sack with the concentration of a woman who found the flour genuinely interesting. "I can't tell you anything." "I know," Vivian said. "I'm not asking you to." A pause. "Then why—" "I'm going to tell you something," Vivian said. "You don't have to respond. You don't have to do anything." Margaret's hand stayed on the flour sack. "We have a signed letter from Calvin Rourke commissioning the falsified survey," Vivian said very quietly, very evenly. "We have the surveyor's affidavit. We have the certified county records showing the bearing discrepancy. We have the loan amendment timeline connected to the water rights filing. We have documented financial discrepancies in the ranch loan records going back 4 years. She paused. "The fraud case is built. What's still needed is the bank-side documentation showing how the loan records were accessed and who authorized the separate filing protocol. That evidence protects the people who didn't know. It identifies the people who did." Margaret was very still. "A federal investigation into land fraud is different from a civil property case," Vivian continued. "Federal investigators ask different questions and they ask them of different people. The people who processed records under instruction are very rarely the people those investigations focus on. That focus lands on the people who gave the instructions." She picked up a flour sack. "I'm buying flour." "You're buying flour. We haven't spoken." She moved to the next table. She didn't look back at Margaret Toll. She finished her market list, paid at the front, and walked back to where she'd hitched the mare. She stood there for a moment, letting the morning settle. 11 days to the harvest festival. 14 days to the foreclosure deadline. She rode home. Margaret Toll's package arrived at Harlan Webb's office the following Monday. Webb sent word to Iron Mesa the same day. A sealed envelope delivered by his assistant, a young man who came to the gate and asked for Miss Hale specifically, which told her Webb was already taking certain precautions. Inside, a letter from Webb, 3 sentences, which was his style when the facts were clear. Margaret Toll had provided a sworn statement documenting that Aldous Fenn had established a separate filing protocol for the Iron Mesa loan account 18 months ago, under instruction from a board member. The statement named the board member. The statement also included copies of internal bank memos that Fenn had apparently never expected anyone to find, because he'd filed them in a back archive rather than destroying them, which was the kind of mistake careful criminals make when they're more afraid of losing evidence than of being found. The board member named in Margaret Toll's statement was Calvin Rourke. Webb had already contacted the Territorial Fraud Examiner's office. She read the letter twice, standing at the gate where Webb's assistant had delivered it, in the flat October morning with the windmill turning behind her and the sound of the ranch going about its business in every direction. Then she walked inside and told Gideon. He sat with it for a long moment. The kind of long moment that isn't empty, but full of 2 years of legal pressure and 6 years of carefully engineered destruction, and a father who died knowing the numbers didn't add up, and nobody believing him. What happens now? He said. Now the fraud examiner's office opens an investigation, which takes time we don't have before the foreclosure deadline. She sat down. But we have something else. We have enough to go to the court that's considering the emergency stay motion and argue that the loan's triggering conditions were manufactured by the same party who benefits from the foreclosure. That's not just fraud. That's conflict of interest in the legal proceeding itself. She looked at her notes. Webb needs to add all of this to the stay motion today. I'll go to Webb now, Gideon said. Take the copies. Not the originals. Keep the originals here. He was already standing. He stopped and looked at her. You knew Toll would do it. I thought she might, Vivian said. I didn't know. But you thought she would. She watched something wrong happen inside an institution she'd given years to, Vivian said. She had a way to correct it that didn't require her to sacrifice everything she'd built. Most people, when they're given that specific combination, will take it. She paused. Most people want to do the right thing. They just need to believe it won't cost them everything. Gideon left for Webb's office. Vivian went back to the table and began preparing for the Harvest Festival. Not in the way a woman prepares for a social event, in the way a person prepares for the most important public moment of a legal and personal conflict that has been building for 3 weeks, and in Rourke's case for 6 years. She knew he would be there. The Harvest Festival was the largest community gathering in the territory. Ranchers, merchants, county officials, neighboring landowners, families from 3 counties. Calvin Rourke attended every year. He was a prominent man. Prominent men attended these things because the attendance itself was a form of influence. She also knew that when Rourke learned the full extent of what had been filed against him, and he would learn, his lawyers were too good for him not to know within days. His first instinct would not be to quietly accept the investigation. His first instinct would be to go on offense, to take the narrative public before the investigation could define it, to make the story about something other than what it actually was. And the Harvest Festival, with its crowd and its community standing and its implicit authority of the man who had dominated this territory for 20 years, would be exactly the stage he would choose for that. She intended to be ready. The court granted the emergency stay on the foreclosure with 5 days to spare. Webb sent word on a Tuesday afternoon, and Vivian was at the main table when the message came, and she read it and set it down and sat very quietly for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on nothing in particular, because the relief was significant enough that she needed somewhere to put it before she could move on. The stay meant Rourke could not complete the foreclosure while the fraud investigation was pending. It meant the clock had stopped. It meant Iron Mesa Ranch was not going to auction. It did not mean the fight was over. Mrs. Eula appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Vivian's face and read it with the accuracy she brought to most things. "Good news," she said. Not a question. "The stay was granted," Vivian said. Mrs. Eula exhaled through her nose in a way that was, by her standards, the equivalent of anyone else collapsing with relief. Then she said, "I'm making a proper supper tonight," and went back into the kitchen, and from the sounds that followed, she meant it. Gideon came in an hour later, and Vivian told him, and what happened on his face was something she looked at carefully and then looked away from, because it was the kind of thing a person deserved to have privately. "It's not finished," she said. "The investigation will take months. Rourke's lawyers will challenge everything. The water rights case still needs a formal resolution once the boundary review comes back." "I know," he said. "And the Harvest Festival is in 4 days. I think he's going to use it." He looked at her. "What do you mean, use it?" "I mean, I think when Rourke understands the full scope of what's been filed, the fraud investigation, the stay motion, the boundary review, all of it at once, He's not going to process it quietly. He's going to do what men like him do when they feel control slipping. He's going to try to take it back publicly. She folded her hands. He's going to come to that festival and say something about the ranch, about me. Gideon's expression went very still. About you. I'm the most vulnerable piece of this, she said matter-of-factly. I'm the easiest thing to attack. I have no official standing here. I came to this town under circumstances that... She stopped. People on that platform saw me arrive. They know how I got here and why I was turned away. If Rourke tells a story about a desperate woman who attached herself to a failing ranch and manufactured a fraud case for her own benefit, some people will believe it. Enough people might believe it to create public doubt about the investigation before it's complete. They won't believe it, Gideon said. It came out harder than he'd probably intended. Some will, she said. People believe things that let them feel like the powerful man in their community is still trustworthy, because the alternative is that they've been wrong about him for a long time, and that's uncomfortable. She looked at him directly. I'm not saying it to be discouraging. I'm saying it so we go to that festival prepared. He held her eyes. What does prepared look like? It looks like bringing every piece of documentation we have, not to show people, to have, if he makes it necessary. She paused. And it looks like not letting him control what room we're in or who we're standing with when he does it. He nodded slowly. Gideon. She said his name because what she was about to say needed a name attached to it. If he says what I think he's going to say, about why I'm here, about my motives, about what I am to this ranch, I need to know that you'll stand beside me, not in front of me, beside me. The specific thing she meant was not small, and they both understood it. Yes, he said. No hesitation. I'll be there. She nodded once. Then she looked back at her papers, because there was still work to do before the festival, and doing it was the thing she knew how to offer. But the words stayed with her through the evening, the specific, uncomplicated weight of, yes, I'll be there. In a way that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with what it meant to be believed by someone who had seen you at your most uncertain and decided you were still worth standing next to. She worked until midnight. Then she went to bed, and for the first time since arriving in Red Bluff, she slept without the sequence running. The morning of the Harvest Festival, Vivian woke before dawn and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about her mother. Not for any particular reason she could name. Her mother had been a practical woman, not given to speeches or dramatic gestures, who had expressed love primarily through the doing of things rather than the saying of them, mending clothes that could have been replaced, keeping records for the household that nobody asked her to keep, teaching Vivian to read contracts before she taught her to read novels, because, she'd said, novels were about people who didn't exist and contracts were about people who would absolutely take what you had if you let them. Her mother had also been the one who told her, at 17, after a boy in the village had said something cutting about her plainness in front of his friends, "You don't need them to like you. You need them to be unable to dismiss you. Those are completely different goals, and only one of them is worth working for." Vivian had carried that distinction for 15 years without fully understanding it until this morning, sitting in the dark in a small room in a ranch that had nearly been stolen, thinking about what today required. She got up. She dressed in her best dress. Not her finest dress from Philadelphia, which would have read as performance, but the good blue wool, clean and pressed, that communicated someone who took the day seriously without announcing that she'd spent the morning preparing for a confrontation. She did her hair with care. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for exactly long enough to confirm that she looked like herself and not like someone trying to look like something else. Then she went out to the kitchen, where Mrs. Eula was already making biscuits with the focused efficiency of a woman who has been making biscuits in difficult circumstances for 40 years and considers biscuits non-negotiable regardless of what else is happening. "Eat," Mrs. Eula said, without turning around. Vivian ate. Gideon came in from the early chores with hay on his jacket and the particular composure of a man who had also been awake before dawn and had spent the time doing something physical to keep the waiting from eating him. He looked at Vivian across the kitchen, just briefly, a checking look, and she gave him a small nod that meant she was ready, and he gave her one back that meant the same thing. And they ate breakfast without talking much because everything that needed to be said had been said the night before, going over the documents one more time, confirming what was in the satchel, agreeing on the sequence if it came to that. Daniel ate quickly and asked if he could ride to the festival in the wagon. Gideon said yes. Mrs. Eula, without being asked, said she was also coming, and the tone she used made it clear this was information rather than a request. The festival grounds were at the edge of Red Bluff, in the flat open space east of the main road that served as the territory's communal gathering place for events large enough to need it. By the time the Iron Mesa wagon arrived, the grounds were already active, booths and tables in various stages of setup, horses tied along the fence rows, children in the specific state of contained chaos that comes from being given one day when the normal rules are loosened. The smell was wood smoke and bread and the particular dusty sweetness of autumn in dry country. People noticed the wagon. She could see it, the slight pause in movement, the redirected attention. Not everyone, but enough to confirm that the last several weeks had not gone unobserved in Red Bluff, that the rumors of something happening at Iron Mesa Ranch had been circulating in the way that news circulates in small communities, partially and inaccurately, but persistently. Gideon tied up the horses. Vivian climbed down with the satchel over her shoulder and walked into the festival ground beside him, not behind him and not in front of him, beside him, exactly as she'd said she needed to be. The first hour was almost ordinary. They spoke with Pete Aldred, who clasped Gideon's hand and looked at Vivian with a frank, approving directness that she liked. They spoke with Harlan Webb, who had come with his wife and who managed to communicate in the careful, sideways language of a man who rarely said things plainly, that the fraud examiner's preliminary response had been substantial. Two families Vivian hadn't met came over to speak with Gideon and made a point of acknowledging her, which was its own kind of statement in a community where acknowledging someone was a public act. She also saw Calvin Rourke. He arrived mid-morning with three men she didn't recognize and his local attorney, a man named Slade, who wore his suits too well for the occasion and carried himself with the specific arrogance of someone who considers the people around him a lower grade of human. Rourke himself was older than she'd expected from the way people talked about him, perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the broad-shouldered build of a man who had once done physical work and now didn't, but retained the frame. He had a face that had learned over many years to look like whatever was most useful, and right now it was arranged in the pleasant, familiar ease of a man entirely at home in his territory. She watched him scan the crowd when he arrived. She watched him find Gideon. She watched him find her. Something moved through his expression, not alarm, not yet, but a recalculation, the brief narrowing of a man updating his information. Then he smiled. A wide, public smile directed at nothing in particular, and he turned toward a group of county officials standing near the main pavilion and began working the crowd with the smooth efficiency of someone who has done it for decades and considers it a natural function, like breathing. "He knows," Gideon said quietly beside her. "Yes," she said. "How much does he know?" "Enough." She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder. "He'll make his move in the next hour. He'll want to do it before the afternoon when people start leaving. He needs the full crowd." They waited. It was the hardest kind of waiting, active, visible, public waiting, where you couldn't show the waiting on your face because the face was being read by 100 people who were also watching the man on the other side of the crowd and trying to understand what was about to happen. Cully, the old hand who had given her information about Hask at the feed store fence, appeared at her elbow with the unhurried materialization of very old men who have nowhere particular to be. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, looking out at the crowd, "Rourke's been talking to people this morning, before you got here." "I expected that," Vivian said. "Said you've been using Mercer's situation to run some kind of scheme." He said it flatly, without heat. "Said you came here with nothing and you've been manipulating a grieving man." She felt the words land, which they did, because words like that always land no matter how prepared you are for them. Then she felt the place underneath where they landed, which was solid. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Cully nodded. "My father lost land to a man like Rourke," he said. 40 years ago. Different territory. Same method." He moved away with the same unhurried drift with which he'd appeared. She looked at Gideon. He had heard. His jaw was at the angle it went when he was controlling something. "Let him say it where everyone can hear it," she said quietly. Don't respond to the version he's been saying privately. Make him say it publicly, where I can answer it. Gideon looked at her. You're sure? I'm sure. It happened at 11:30 in the open space near the main pavilion where the crowd was thickest. She didn't engineer it. She didn't need to. Rourke engineered it himself because men who have controlled a narrative for 20 years trust the tools that have always worked. And his tools were public confidence and social authority and the community's ingrained habit of deferring to him. He came toward them through the crowd with Slade at his shoulder. And the crowd noticed and made way the way crowds make way for the person they expect to be in charge of a moment. He stopped perhaps 10 feet from where Vivian and Gideon stood. And he looked at Gideon first, the specific look of a man who has decided to be reasonable and expects his reasonableness to be acknowledged. Gideon, he said, I think it's past time we talked. All right, Gideon said. This business with the court filings. Rourke shook his head with an expression of patient disappointment. I understand you're in a difficult situation. I've always respected your family, but the claims being made are serious and they're unfounded, and I think someone has been giving you very bad counsel. His eyes moved to Vivian. I understand you had nowhere to go when you arrived. I understand you've been in a hard place, but using a vulnerable man's legal troubles to... Mr. Rourke. Vivian said it clearly, not loudly, but clearly enough that the people immediately around them stopped pretending they weren't listening and simply listened. I'd like to make sure I understand the claim you're making. Are you saying that the documents filed with the territorial court are false? He looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who expected to be interrupted by someone less precise. I'm saying they represent a misunderstanding of the certified survey copies from the Dalton County records, she said. Those are official territorial documents bearing the county clerk's seal. Are you saying those are false? The interpretation of those surveys. The bearing on your property's eastern line is 251 degrees, she said. The bearing on the original land grant survey is 247 degrees. That's a factual discrepancy in a public record. It doesn't require interpretation. She kept her voice even, not heated. She was not angry, or rather she was, but the anger had been converted over the last 4 weeks into something more precise and useful than heat. The surveyor who filed your property survey has provided a signed affidavit explaining that he was engaged by you to file those bearings, and has provided the letter you signed commissioning that work, which cited a corrective document that does not exist in the official record. Something changed in the crowd. She could feel it, a collective adjustment, the shift of an audience that has just received information that revises what they thought they were watching. Rourke's expression had done something complicated. The patient disappointment was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something had gone tight. I don't know what this woman has told you. I have the letter here, Vivian said. She opened the satchel. Not hurriedly, deliberately, the way you handle something when you want the room to understand that you came prepared. She took out the certified copy of Rourke's letter to Hask and held it up. Not waving it, just holding it visible. Your signature, your stationery, dated 6 years ago. Commissioning a survey correction citing a document that the Territorial Records Office has confirmed was never filed. That document could have been, I also have a sworn statement from a records employee at Territorial Savings Bank, she said, documenting that the loan account for Iron Mesa Ranch was maintained in a separate filing system established 18 months ago under instruction from a board member. She looked at him directly. The board member named in the statement is you. The crowd was very quiet. It was not a performance. She was aware that it might look like one, the documents, the sequence, the public setting, but it wasn't. Everything she'd just said was a fact attached to a piece of paper in her satchel, and the reason she was saying it here publicly, rather than only in court filings, was standing beside her and had been standing beside her for 4 weeks while she worked 18-hour days at his kitchen table, and his name was Gideon Mercer, and 6 years of someone else's calculated theft was not something you answered only in legal documents. You also answered it in front of the community that had watched it happen without knowing what it was. Rourke looked at the crowd. She watched him do it. The quick read of the room, the assessment of whether the authority he'd built over 20 years was still holding. She watched him read what she was also reading, which was that it wasn't. Not entirely. Not anymore. Pete Aldred was standing with his arms crossed and his face closed. The county officials near the pavilion had gone still in the way of men who are deciding whether to continue being associated with a position. Cully was watching from the edge with the expression of someone who has waited a long time for a specific thing and is now seeing it. "This is not the place for legal arguments," Rourke said. His voice had shifted, still controlled but thinner. The pleasantness had gone somewhere. "You chose this place," Vivian said. "You've been speaking to people this morning about my character and my motives. I'm offering the same crowd the facts." She lowered the document. "If you believe the court filings are in error, you have legal representation that can contest them. But I won't stand here while you tell this community a story about me that replaces the actual story, which is that you spent 6 years engineering the financial destruction of a family's ranch in order to steal it." Slade stepped forward. "You can't make that claim publicly without—" "It's in the court filing," Harlan Webb said from somewhere in the crowd, in the dry, precise voice of a man who had spent a career being the quietest person in the room and had decided today was not that day. "Filed with the territorial court 4 days ago. It's public record. Anyone here can read it." Slade looked at Webb. Something passed between the two lawyers that had nothing to do with the crowd, a rapid, professional assessment of the situation. Then Slade looked at Rourke. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no collapse, no moment of cinematic confession. What happened was quieter, and Vivian thought, more true to how things actually end when they end because of evidence rather than confrontation. Rourke looked at the crowd one more time. He was a man who had built everything on the understanding of what a room full of people was prepared to believe about him. He was reading, in real time, that this particular room had been revised. Not all of it, not instantly, but enough. The social authority that had been the foundation of every legal and financial maneuver for 6 years was cracking in the specific way that authority cracks when the story underneath it is finally told out loud in front of the people it was told to. He looked at Vivian. For the first time since he'd walked toward them, he looked at her without calculation, just directly, one person to another, in the way that sometimes happens between adversaries at the exact moment when one of them understands they have lost. Then he turned and walked away. Not storming, not retreating. Walking, with Slade at his shoulder, back through the crowd that moved aside with a different kind of deference than it had shown when he'd arrived. The crowd was quiet for a moment after he left. Then Pete Aldred said, to nobody in particular, "Well," and the crowd released itself back into the ordinary sounds of a festival morning, and Vivian let out a breath she'd been managing carefully for the last 10 minutes. Gideon was beside her. He hadn't moved from beside her for the entire exchange, hadn't stepped forward, hadn't interrupted, hadn't tried to be the voice of it. He had stood where she'd asked him to stand, and his standing there had said to everyone watching everything that needed to be said about where he positioned himself relative to her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because honesty seemed appropriate given everything, "My hands are shaking." He looked at her hands. They were slightly, the delayed physical response to the adrenaline she'd been holding in check. He put his hand over both of hers briefly, in the unsentimental way that he did things that were nevertheless completely intentional. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "And the investigation isn't finished." "I know." "And the boundary review still needs to—" "Vivian," he said her name in the tone he used when she was using work to avoid something. "For 5 minutes. Can we just be here for 5 minutes?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the festival around them, the booths and the children and the October light coming in low and golden over everything, and she understood what he was asking for, which was not a break from the work, but permission to stand in the middle of something they'd built and acknowledge that it was real. 5 minutes, she said. Mrs. Eula found them 20 minutes later, which told Vivian that the woman had been watching from somewhere nearby and had given them more time than the 5 minutes specifically because she had decided they needed it. She appeared at Vivian's elbow with a plate of food and the look of a woman who intends the plate to be accepted without discussion. "Rourke's men left already," she said. Slade went with them. She pressed the plate into Vivian's hands. "People are talking. Half of them already knew something wasn't right. They were just waiting to say it." "They were waiting for someone else to say it first," Vivian said. "Same thing." Mrs. Eula looked at her for a moment with the frank, assessing look she'd had since the first evening. Then she said, "Thomas would have liked you." She meant Gideon's father. She said it simply, without elaboration, and moved away before Vivian had to decide how to respond to it. She ate the food. The territorial fraud examination took 4 months. Vivian had expected 3 and prepared herself for 6, so 4 felt like reasonable territory. She spent most of those months at the kitchen table at Iron Mesa Ranch, which had become, without formal announcement or deliberate decision, the place where she worked and lived and increasingly where she was. The investigators contacted her twice for clarification on the financial documentation. Both times she provided exactly what they asked for, with the organized precision that had been her consistent mode since the first night with the tin box. And both times they left with more than they'd come with because she had anticipated what they'd need next and prepared it. Aldous Fenn, the bank loan officer, cooperated with the investigation in the first month. He had apparently been waiting for someone to give him the structure within which cooperation was the safer option, which it now clearly was. His cooperation filled in the bank-side gaps that Margaret Toll's statement had opened. The specific conversations with Rourke, the instructions about the separate filing system, the timing of the loan amendment, and the promise of a position in Rourke's land company as compensation. There was no land company. Or rather, there had been, a shell structure designed to absorb the Iron Mesa land after the auction. Its existence, documented in Fenn's testimony, was the piece of evidence that transformed the case from a bilateral property fraud into a broader conspiracy. And it was that broader conspiracy designation that brought in the federal examiners, which was the thing that finally made Calvin Rourke's capital law firm quietly calculate the comparative costs of fighting and settling. They settled in the 4th month, not out of honor. There was no honor in it on Rourke's side, and Vivian never expected any. They settled because the math had changed, because the federal involvement made continued denial more expensive than resolution, and because 2 witnesses Rourke had apparently counted on to hold their accounts had revised those accounts once they understood the federal dimension. The settlement terms were detailed and required a full week of Webb's time to review, during which Vivian sat with him for most of it because Webb was an honest man and a careful one, but the financial instruments involved were specialized enough that he needed someone who understood what the terms actually meant in practice versus what they appeared to mean on the page. She caught 2 clauses in the second draft that would have allowed Rourke's attorneys to argue, 6 months later, that certain penalties had already been discharged by the initial payment. She flagged them both. The clauses were removed. The final settlement restored the original boundary survey as the legal property line, permanently and on the official record. It dismissed the water rights case with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. It canceled the predatory loan amendment and replaced it with terms based on the original pre-amendment agreement, with an adjusted interest rate that reflected what the rate should have been without the artificially accelerated timeline. The financial discrepancies from the bank records, the $900+ of misrecorded debt that had been compounding for 4 years, were acknowledged and reversed. Rourke also paid a civil penalty, not as large as it should have been, which was true of most civil penalties in Vivian's experience, but real and documented and public. Aldous Fenn lost his position at Territorial Savings. He did not face criminal charges, which Vivian had a complicated feeling about, because his cooperation had been valuable, and the framework that allowed that trade was one she'd used deliberately. She sat with the complicated feeling and didn't resolve it, because some things don't resolve, and honesty requires knowing the difference. Clement Hask was not charged. His voluntary affidavit was noted in the official record. She heard several months later through Pete Aldred that his son had indeed become a land surveyor and was doing straight work in a neighboring county. She didn't know if that was connected to anything or not. She decided it was not her business to find out. The ranch itself, the day-to-day reality of Iron Mesa, which had continued functioning throughout all of this because cattle and horses and kitchen gardens do not pause for legal proceedings, had changed in ways that were harder to document but more immediately visible. The books were clean, genuinely clean, not the superficial tidiness of organized chaos, but the structural health of an operation that understood where its money was and where it was going. The debt was real and manageable and mapped against a repayment plan she'd built that was conservative enough to survive a bad year and efficient enough to allow actual progress in a good one. She'd found 2 additional revenue streams that the ranch had been positioned to pursue for years but hadn't, because nobody had been doing the analysis. A grazing lease to a neighboring operation that had land but not enough water access, which was resolved pleasingly by the restored creek boundary, and a supply arrangement with the new schoolhouse that was being built 12 miles north. The schoolhouse arrangement was her favorite. She'd negotiated it herself, and it paid less than the other two, and she didn't care. Daniel had finished the arithmetic primer and was working through a second one she'd ordered from the catalog in Dalton. He still didn't say much, but the things he said had gotten more precise over the months, which she recognized as the specific growth of a person whose thinking is outpacing their previous vocabulary for it. She left books on the kitchen table. He removed them on his own schedule. Mrs. Eula had, at some point in the third month, begun leaving coffee ready for Vivian in the morning before Vivian was awake, which was Mrs. Eula's version of an unambiguous statement of position. They didn't discuss it. What happened between Vivian and Gideon happened slowly, which was appropriate, because they were both people who had reasons to be careful and who understood the difference between what you felt in the middle of something difficult and what you felt when the difficulty had passed and you could see clearly. What she felt when the difficulty had passed and she could see clearly was that she had not wanted to leave. That was the whole of it, really. Not a dramatic realization, more like the simple, solid fact you find when you finished clearing away everything else. She didn't want to leave this kitchen table and these survey maps and this windmill sound and this man who had stood beside her without being asked twice. He asked her in October, a year from when she'd arrived. They were on the porch in the evening, which had become a habit without either of them naming it as such. The end of the working day, the light going down over the west pasture. The kind of quiet that feels earned rather than empty. He'd been working toward it for several minutes. She could tell from the way he was holding his coffee cup and not drinking it, which was what he did when he was composing something he wanted to say correctly. "I know this wasn't what you came here for," he said. "No," she agreed. "And I know the situation when you arrived wasn't, you didn't have a lot of options." "I had some," she said. "I chose this one." He looked at her. "You chose the work." "I chose all of it," she said. "The work was part of all of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes about your position here. The work, the wages, the room, none of that is conditional." "I know that," she said. "Vivian." He said her name the way he said it when he meant it to carry weight. "I would like you to stay, not as the person who manages the books, as my wife. If you—" He stopped, started again with the honesty that was his consistent mode. "I'm not good at this. I haven't done it, and I'm probably doing it wrong. But I don't want to not say it because I'm afraid of doing it wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. The first thing she thought about was the platform, the 3-line letter, "Not what I require." She thought about what she'd been then, not weaker exactly, but less certain of what she was worth and what she was for. She thought about the woman who had dragged a trunk 6 inches across a platform and refused to cry in front of strangers. She had not come here looking for a man to rescue her. She had come here looking for nothing because she'd had nothing to look for, and what she'd found instead was a problem worth solving and a community worth being part of, and a kitchen table where she was permitted to work until midnight, and a man who asked questions and then waited for the actual answers. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything she'd been too practical to let herself want. "You didn't do it wrong," she said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand in the same matter-of-fact, intentional way he'd covered her shaking hands at the festival, and they sat on the porch while the light finished going down and the windmill turned in the evening wind, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more, because some things are complete without being explained. They married in December in the front room of Iron Mesa Ranch, with Webb witnessing and Mrs. Eula making something that was probably the best food the kitchen had produced in a decade. And Pete Aldred came with his family, and Daniel sat in the corner and watched with the expression of a boy who finds the whole proceeding somewhat unnecessary, but recognizes that the adults are happy and has decided to allow it. The years that followed were not simple. That's the truth of it, and Vivian would have said so if anyone had asked, because she had no patience for the version of things that smooths out what was actually hard. There were bad cattle years, and a drought in the 3rd year, and a disagreement with the county assessor that took 2 months to resolve, and a period in the 5th year when Gideon was sick long enough that she ran the entire operation alone and understood, in a visceral way she hadn't before, what it had cost him to do it alone for as long as he had. There were also things she hadn't expected. The way a hard winter makes you grateful for exactly the walls around you. The way Daniel, at 16, told her without preamble that he wanted to study land surveying, and the way that felt. The way the kitchen table, which had been a place she'd worked at in a practical emergency, became the place where the shape of a life was built. The plans and the accounts and the letters, and eventually the homework of children who arrived and had opinions about everything and were allowed to, because that was the kind of house it was. She kept the 3-line letter from Edmund Graves, not out of bitterness, that had converted itself into something more useful a long time ago. She kept it in the tin box where the original ranch documents had been, which lived in the back room alongside the certified copies from Dalton and Hask's affidavit and the settlement agreement, all of it organized in a way that would be legible to anyone who needed to read it. She kept it because it was the beginning of a record. And records mattered. She had believed that before she came to Red Bluff, and she believed it more completely now, having seen what happened when records were kept and what happened when they weren't. One evening, sitting on the porch that had become her place to think at the end of a day, she tried to articulate, not for anyone else, just for herself, what she thought the whole thing had taught her: the platform, and the trunk, and the tin box, and the lamp, and Dalton, and mill race, and the harvest festival, and the porch, and the years. What she came to was this: the world does not organize itself in favor of the people who deserve it. It organizes itself in favor of the people who do the work, and that work is not always the kind that anyone sees or names or considers important until the moment when it turns out to be the only thing that mattered. The woman keeping books in a back room, the clerk who doesn't throw away the letter, the man who stands next to someone instead of in front of them. Small, unglamorous, persistent things. She had been all of those things. Gideon had been all of those things. Mrs. Eula, Pete Aldred, Margaret Toll, even Clement Hask in the end, all of them had been, in their different ways, the kind of person who doesn't make the story, but without whom the story doesn't turn out right. The windmill turned above the yard. The evening was coming in from the west the way it always did, long and level and honest about its intentions. Vivian Hale, Mercer now, though she still thought of herself as Hale in the mornings before the rest of the day began, leaned back in the porch chair and let the evening come, and was, without drama or performance or any particular fanfare, completely at home. The frontier had not given her anything. She had taken what she needed from it, the same way she'd always taken what she needed from difficult things, which was by understanding them better than they understood themselves and refusing, even when it would have been easier, to pretend they were something other than what they were. That had been enough. It had been, in the end, exactly enough.